scent of lemon polish mixed with the faint fragrance of roses as Alina dragged the heavy mop bucket across the grand marble floor of the Royal Orion Hotel's ballroom. Her Aunt Maria had fallen ill the night before and begged Alina to take her place for one shift, just one shift, to keep her job secure, and Alina had reluctantly agreed, her heart pounding at the idea of being anywhere near the rich and beautiful people who graced the towering halls of the hotel, kind of people she'd only ever seen through glossy windows or in borrowed magazines she'd read behind the school library shelves, but she couldn't say no, not when her aunt had raised her like a daughter after her own mother vanished when Alina was 10 and her father buried himself in debts and distance. Now dressed in the oversized beige uniform and cap that swallowed her thin frame, she moved quietly, careful not to scratch the pristine floor as she wiped away imaginary smudges. She didn't know this was the night of the Autumn Masquerade, one of the city's most prestigious events, with guests arriving in gowns that cost more than her college tuition dreams and tuxedos pressed to perfection. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers that seemed to weep gold, and as she bent down to clean a stubborn spot near the grand piano, a tall man with sharp eyes and a warm smile walked in, followed by a cluster of murmuring assistants. His presence commanded the room in a quiet, unspoken way, like he belonged not just to the hotel but to the world that created it. And Alina tried to disappear behind the curtain of a floral display, but her mop clattered to the ground. Drawing his gaze, she froze, expecting to be scolded or dismissed or mocked. But instead, he tilted his head curiously and stepped closer, ignoring the whispers of those around him. His black mask hung from one hand, the other resting in his trouser pocket as he studied her, not with judgment, but with something like intrigue. He asked softly, "Why are you cleaning?" And Alina, who had never been noticed in this way, didn't know what to say. She gripped the mop handle tighter, trying to steady her racing heart, and muttered, "I'm just helping my aunt. She's sick, I'm not." "Really, staff, just for tonight." Her voice barely above the soft piano playing in the background, he smiled. Not mockingly, but almost like he understood, like he recognized something familiar in her eyes, and he extended his hand gently, saying, "Well, I'm Nicholas, and this is my hotel, or at least part of it, so I think you deserve a break, don't you?" Shocked, she stared at his hand, then at his face, then back at the marble floor, unsure if this was kindness or a cruel joke, but something in his expression disarmed her. It was warm and genuine, and so she hesitantly took his hand, and he helped her to her feet, brushing dust from her shoulder as if she belonged in silk, not starch. He looked at the clock, then said, "I have a suit in one of the dressing rooms meant for a guest who didn't arrive. Come with me just for a moment, please." She started to protest, to explain how wildly inappropriate it would be. But he said, "You're not pretending to be someone else. You're just stepping into a moment that's been waiting for you," and the way he said it made her chest ache in a way she didn't understand, so she followed him down the velvet-draped corridor into a room filled with mirrors and gowns and polished shoes. He handed her a dress the color of midnight, with tiny gems like stars stitched along the hem, and whispered, "Wear it for the world to see what I see in you." And then he stepped out, giving her space to change, and for a long moment she stood trembling, staring at the dress, at herself, and the girl in the mirror who looked like someone else entirely. Then slowly she peeled off the baggy uniform and slid into the fabric, feeling it hug her in ways nothing had ever hugged her. And when she stepped out, Nicholas let out a soft breath and said, "I knew it. You were never meant to be invisible. Come with me just for one dance." And they returned to the ballroom. Now bathed in amber light and filled with music and magic, no one questioned her presence. They just watched as Nicholas led her to the center of the floor and took her hand gently, as if she were made of glass. And as they danced in slow, elegant circles, Alina forgot about mops and shifts and bills, and just let herself exist in the moment, floating among chandeliers and whispers. She didn't notice the jealous eyes or the murmurs beginning to ripple through the crowd, because all she saw was the way he looked at her, like she was more than just a girl with a borrowed name and a cleaning job, but a story worth knowing, a life worth seeing. And she didn't know where the night was heading, only that for the first time it felt like something was beginning instead of ending, something soft and new and terrifying, She whispered to him, "Why? Did you pick me?" And he smiled and said, "Because when I saw you, I saw someone I didn't want to miss." And those words lodged in her chest like light, and even though reality loomed somewhere outside the hotel walls, she clung to the warmth of his voice and the strength of his hand, praying the clock wouldn't strike whatever hour turned dreams into chores again, because for now she was someone else, or maybe someone she had always been waiting to become. The music grew louder as more guests flooded the ballroom, dressed in velvets and silks, their laughter dancing through the air like confetti, and Alina, still in the midnight gown Nicholas had given her, stayed close to his side, afraid that if she blinked it would all vanish, the marble beneath her feet, the chandeliers above, the way the waiters moved like ghosts in tuxedos, and the way he kept glancing at her as if to reassure her she was real. She felt every heartbeat in her throat when he gently guided her to a long glass table set with glittering glasses and gold-plated cutlery, offering her a chair with a quiet grace that made her wonder how many women had sat across from him, and how many had looked at him the way she now did, with awe and confusion and fear of falling. But Nicholas only smiled and asked if she was all right, and she nodded, though her hands trembled slightly under the table, because what could she possibly say? "I'm just the cleaner's niece who put on the wrong dress and wandered into someone else's life instead." She whispered, "Thank you," and he simply said, "I'm glad you're here," like it wasn't an accident, but something written into the night itself. And as the music softened and the lights dimmed, a woman with sharp red lips and colder eyes drifted toward them, wearing a sapphire gown and carrying herself like royalty. She leaned toward Nicholas and whispered something that made his jaw tighten slightly before he turned to Alina with a soft apology and said, "I'll be back in a moment," and walked away with the woman in tow, leaving Alina at the table surrounded by crystal and chatter and strangers who barely noticed her presence. She folded her hands and tried not to fidget, wondering if she had overstepped, if she should slip away quietly before anyone discovered the truth that she didn't belong. But before she could rise, a young server passed and murmured under his breath, "You're braver than most," and then moved on without explanation, leaving her confused and uneasy. And moments later, an older man with silver hair and a curved cane approached her with a glint in his eyes as he said, "You must be the girl." He finally noticed the one not painted in gold and diamonds, but still managing to glow. She didn't answer, unsure who he was or what he meant, but he nodded to himself and added, "Sometimes the right ones come disguised as mistakes," then walked away chuckling, as though he'd spoken a riddle meant for someone wiser. Alina watched as Nicholas returned, his expression unreadable. The woman gone, his hand curling around a champagne flute he didn't drink from, and when he sat beside her, he didn't speak immediately, just looked out over the crowd like he was searching for something, then turned back to her and asked, "Have you ever danced on the rooftop?" And she blinked, surprised, and shook her head, and he stood offering his hand once more, saying, "Then let's fix that." So she followed him through arched doorways, past curious eyes and secret stairwells, until they reached a terrace where the city spread out like a sea of stars below them, the wind playing with her hair and the dress rippling around her ankles. And he took her hand again and pulled her close. No music this time, just the quiet of the night and the distant hum of traffic, and it was there, with the city beneath them and the sky above, that Alina began to understand this wasn't just a moment of kindness or a mistake of identity. It was something else, something shifting, something that made her feel seen, not as a fantasy, but as herself. And when she dared to ask why he'd brought her up here, he looked at her with eyes full of things he hadn't said, and replied, "Because the world down there has rules and names and masks, but up here, we can just be." And she didn't know what to do with that kind of freedom. So she let him hold her, and they swayed gently between clouds and towers, until a distant voice called his name, sharp and urgent, and he pulled back reluctantly, saying, "I'm sorry. Oh, I have to handle something. Stay here, please." And then he was gone, leaving her breathless and alone with the wind in her thoughts. She wandered to the edge of the terrace and looked out over the glowing skyline, wondering what her aunt would say if she could see her now, or what her younger self would think of this girl in a gown dancing with someone who saw her like she mattered. And suddenly, a voice behind her made her jump. "You're not who they think you are you?" It was the woman from earlier, The one with the red lips. Now standing with her arms crossed and a look that could slice through stone, Alina didn't answer at first, but the woman stepped closer, saying, "You think wearing a pretty dress and catching his attention means? You belong here, you don't. Girls like you never do." And though the words stung, they lit something inside. Alina that had lain quiet for years, something defiant, something proud, and she lifted her chin and replied, "I never said I belonged. I was just being myself. And if that's a problem, it's yours, not mine." The woman scoffed and turned on her heel, vanishing down the corridor, and Alina stood alone. Heart-racing hands clenched, unsure if she should be proud or terrified moments later. Nicholas returned his expression tight, but softening when he saw her and asked, "Are you all right?" And she nodded, but something in her had changed. She was no longer the girl, hiding behind curtains and cleaning tools. She was standing in a place she'd never imagined, facing people who questioned her worth, and still standing tall. Nicholas reached for her hand, and this time she took it without hesitation, letting herself believe in the moment again, and they returned to the ballroom just in time for the final waltz, the crowd parting for them. As if some unspoken magic was guiding their steps, and they danced under the crystal lights, eyes-locked movements. Perfect, not because they'd practiced, but because it felt right. Like two pages meeting in the middle of the same book, and when the music ended, applause rose around them, but Alina barely heard it too, lost in the way Nicholas was still holding her hand like he wasn't ready to let go, and neither was she. But reality has its ways of creeping back in, and soon the evening began to fade, the guests departing, the lights dimming, the gowns disappearing into black cars, and promises made over. Champagne flutes, and Nicholas turned to her one last time, asking, "Will you stay just a bit longer? I want to show you something." And again she followed, this time to a private lounge behind velvet curtains, where the walls were lined with books and the fireplace crackled gently. He poured her a glass of water, not wine, and sat beside her, saying, "I know who you are, and I don't care, because I've met women with titles and fortune and masks, but I've never met anyone who could walk into my world wearing borrowed shoes and make the whole room notice. And I know people will talk, they already are, but I'd rather take a chance on something real than keep pretending I only belong to people who fit a mold." And Alina stared at him hard, thundering, wondering if this was how it felt when the world cracked open to let something new in, and she whispered softly, "But what happens tomorrow?" And he reached for her hand again and said, "Whatever you want to happen." And somehow that felt like the biggest promise anyone had ever made to her, and she believed it, because in his eyes she saw not just fascination or pity, but recognition. Like he had been waiting for someone who would never wear the crown but still light up the room, and she knew then that the night might end. The gown would return to its hanger, and the mop bucket might still be waiting, but something inside her had changed forever, and it was not borrowed, and not accidental, and not something anyone could take away from her again. And as they sat in the quiet lounge, where time seemed to pause just for them, Alina realized she had stepped into a world not because she faked it or forced it, but because she had simply shown up, and someone had seen her, and that was all she had ever needed, and perhaps all she ever would. The morning sun filtered through the tall glass panes of the Royal Orion Hotel, casting golden streaks across the grand halls and marble staircases, and Alina stood quietly at the far edge of the ballroom, barefoot in the same midnight gown, her hair loose from the delicate bun it had been pinned in the night before, her eyes following the soft shimmer of dust dancing in the air as staff bustled around her, resetting the space for a charity breakfast, unaware, or perhaps politely ignoring, the girl who had once been the cleaner's niece and was now something else. Something unnamed and fragile, and echoing through her chest like music that never ended. Nicholas had walked her to the staff wing just hours earlier, insisting on carrying her heels and whispering that this wasn't goodbye, and yet her heart ached with the fear that daylight had a way of unraveling every thread. Sewn by moonlight, she stood now beside the grand piano where they'd first spoken, the mop bucket gone, the floor gleaming, the silence so loud that she barely noticed the woman approaching, until she felt the faint shift of air and the click of heels on marble. The same woman with the red lips, now dressed in crisp morning white, her face tired but firm, her voice a whisper sharper than wind. "Do you know what he's risking for you and Alina?" turned slowly, unsure what answer was safe, what truth was hers to speak. She didn't reply at first, but the woman continued, walking away from Anne. Alliance that took years to build, from names with weight, from plans so carefully drawn, and you think you can offer something better because you dared to be honest and something in? Alina rose like a wave and broke before she even thought her words. Had already found breath. I never asked for him to give anything up. He came to me. I never chased him, and I don't expect him to choose me over his life, but I won't apologize for being seen. The woman blinked for a moment as if surprised by her boldness, then stepped closer and murmured, "Be careful. Not every fairy tale ends in silken crowns. Sometimes it ends with a door closed quietly behind you." And Lena simply nodded. Not because she agreed, but because she knew already that every moment was borrowed and still worth having. And when the woman turned and left, Lena walked to the center of the ballroom once more, letting the silence settle around her like a shawl. She returned the gown to the dressing room where she'd first changed, folded it carefully over the mannequin, and changed into her jeans and sneakers, the uniform already washed and packed in a plastic bag by the door with a small note from the concierge, who had somehow known everything without needing to be told. "Good luck, miss." And when Alina stepped outside into the morning light, the city felt different, brighter, wider, less intimidating, and she didn't know where she was going, but every step felt lighter than it had in years. She walked a long way home, past the library where she used to spend hours reading about places she'd never thought she'd see, past the coffee shop where she once applied for a job and never got a call back, past the old record store where her aunt used to hum the tunes of long-forgotten songs as they passed. And when she reached her aunt's flat, she found Maria sitting up with a warm shawl over her shoulders, a mug of mint tea in her hand, and a curious smile playing on her lips. "You didn't call me all night," she said, her voice rough with worry and affection. Alina sat beside her and told her everything, every moment, every fear, every dance, every whisper, and Maria listened without interrupting, her fingers wrapping gently around Alina's wrist as if grounding her to the moment. And when she finished, Maria chuckled and said, "You've always been different. Not just kind, but brave. I see your mother in you, and I wish she could see you now." And that made Alina's eyes sting, because she hadn't heard her mother's name spoken in years, and she didn't know what her mother would say if she saw her dressed like a dream, walking beside a man who didn't care that she had scrubbed floors and pinched pennies, but she hoped she'd be proud. The days that followed were quiet, almost too quiet, and Alina went back to her classes, caught up on assignments, returned to her part-time job at the campus bookstore, and tried to convince herself that magic had a time limit. But every morning she checked her phone, and every evening she opened her messages, hoping for his name to appear. And then 3 days later it did: "Meet me under the clock tower just after sunset," and her heart nearly burst from her chest. She didn't even respond. She just grabbed her coat and ran. The clock tower stood at the edge of the old botanical garden, its face weathered but proud, its chimes a familiar part of the neighborhood. And when she arrived, he was already there, leaning against the iron railing, his coat billowing slightly in the breeze, his hands in his pockets, and his eyes soft when they landed on her. "I thought maybe you changed your mind," he said, and she laughed, breathless and shaking, and replied, "I thought maybe you had." And he walked toward her like someone moving through a dream, like each step was measured and sure. And when he reached her, he took both her hands and said, "I had meetings, calls, dinners, the usual, but none of it made sense without you. And I know it's only been a few days, but I didn't want to wait months to see you again, and I don't care if the world thinks it's too soon. I just know I feel better when I'm near you, and I don't want to lose that." And Alina looked at him and realized that this man who had grown up in towers and marble had somehow learned to speak to her heart in a language she understood. And she stepped closer and whispered, "I'm scared that this is all going to fall apart." And he smiled gently and said, "It might, but we'll hold it together." And so began something they didn't name, not yet, something that unfolded slowly, carefully, like petals opening in springtime. He visited her at school, walked her home, met her aunt, brought her favorite snacks, and listened to her talk about literature and psychology and the little things that made her eyes shine. And she met his world too, cautiously stepping into dinners and galleries and conferences, never pretending to be someone else, but always carrying herself with quiet strength. And whenever Someone questioned her place by his side. Nicholas always answered first with a look that silenced them, and a hand that found hers like it was meant to fit there. And yet not everything was simple. His business partners grumbled. Family members called him foolish, and socialites whispered that it wouldn't last. And one evening, after a particularly tense gala where Alina had been asked to many polite questions and faced too many disapproving glances, she sat beside him in the back of the car and asked, "Do you ever wonder if it would be easier if I just walked away?" And he looked at her like she had just said the most impossible thing in the world and replied it would be easier, but it wouldn't be right. And I'm not looking for easy. I'm looking for real, and you're the most real thing I've ever known. And in that moment, she knew that no matter what storms waited, they would face them together. And time moved forward as it always does, seasons shifting, blossoms falling new, plants blooming, and one crisp morning Nicholas brought her to the same rooftop where they had danced under the stars, and there among the soft wind and scattered petals, he knelt and asked her to share the rest of her days with him, and she said yes, with tears on her cheeks and joy in her bones. And they didn't become a headline or a scandal, they became a quiet legend. Whispered in corners of ballrooms and kitchens and street cafes, the girl who once mopped the floor now walked beside the man who owned the building, not because she tricked him or changed herself, but because she reminded him of something he'd forgotten: how to hope, how to feel, how to choose. And on the day of their wedding, held not in a palace, but in the same garden beneath the clock tower, Alina stood in a gown her aunt had sewn by hand, and looked into the eyes of the man who once asked why she was cleaning, and now promised to build a world where she never had to prove her worth again. And the wind whispered through the trees, and the bells rang, and the city paused for a moment as two people who should never have met rewrote the story. They were told to accept and chose love instead.